It's great to be here. You're all very fortunate to be here. The Heritage Foundation played a very important role when I was a student in providing information. I was on a liberal campus like a lot of people, and trying to fight the culture war and the war on campus. And the Heritage Foundation was one of those organizations that gave you the information that you needed to combat what was going on everywhere else. And also, it's a great pleasure to be asked to be here by Mrs. Schlafly, who is one of the heroes of the conservative movement. Growing up, you didn't have really that many people to, I went to school in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and you really didn't have that many people to look up to who had the courage to combat really just this cultural tsunami that was washing over traditional America, and it's a great pleasure to be asked to be here. So, Bowing to Beijing. The book came out last year. I spent 4 years in China. Before I went there, I had a kind of a typical, I'd say, conservative view of our relationship with Beijing. And that was this idea that the U.S. relationship with China is predicated on this big gamble. And the gamble is, if we increase our relationship with China, trade with them more, they'll eventually become more like us. And that if we make them richer, automatically they'll become freer. And if people in China get more economic rights, over time they'll demand more political rights. That's the gamble on our side. One of the theses of my book is that that's not necessarily occurring. For one thing, there's this myth that there's this new China now where the middle class is growing fantastically and things are getting better, and that's more or less not true. The middle class there is smaller than our middle class, and that's in a country of 1.3 billion people. But even more significantly, the middle class there isn't as dynamic as ours because the government picks and chooses winners and losers. So it's not based on individual initiative or you work hard, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you can do anything you want. The Communist Party there, after the massacre of Tiananmen Square, the Communist Party scratched their head and they're like, wow, we have a lot of discontent in the country. And what most people don't know, when the tanks rolled in Tiananmen Square, they also had uprisings in hundreds of cities across China, everywhere else. So the government moved in to suppress uprisings across the whole country. So the Communist Party looked in the mirror and said, we have to do something to counter this. So what they decided to do is loosen up a little, continue some economic liberalization, but the idea was specifically to increase the number of rich business people and the middle class, but not to make a free society, but to co-opt the kind of educated classes which had led the revolution before. And that's what they have right now. So the businessmen and the business leaders and the white-collar class all owe where they are to the Communist Party, and are mostly members of the Communist Party. So you're not going to have any friction between, say, the entrepreneurs and the business owners and the party, because they're essentially one and the same. And if anybody bucks the system, they can just be plucked out and replaced with somebody else. I guess the underlining crisis that I address in the book is, and on the back of it, there's this great photo. People think I'm too fixated on it, but it's the President of the United States bowing to Hu Jintao, the President of China. And a picture can speak 1,000 words or more. He's the head of state of the land of the free, and here he is in an act of subservience to the head of a communist state. So I think you have to think what that means, and then look at the policies that he's implementing and wants to implement. and what that means for our relationship with China and America's relationship in the world. And I think you can look at several things, but one is just the amount of debt that President Obama is stacking up. We're at the point where our debt is about 15 trillion and growing. I didn't check this morning, but which is roughly the size of an entire year of economic growth. So everything bought, produced, consumed, all the service of the United States, which is by far the biggest economy in the world, our debt gobbles that up, a whole year's economy of the biggest economy in the world. So you have to think, all these programs that Obama, all these stimulus programs, I mean, where does that money come from? We're broke, we don't have it, so we have to borrow the money. And one of the biggest lenders that's happy to give this money is Beijing. And people don't think about that, but eventually there are policy consequences to being indebted. Can you really continue to be the freest, most powerful country in the world if you're the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world? And I think the answer is no. And then you have to look at who you owe that money to. And in China's case, I think you have to put a value proposition on who these guys are. And this goes back to our original gamble. If we engage them, I mean, the alternative is another question, but if we continue to engage them and make them richer and they're not becoming freer, well, let's take apart exactly how bad these people are to see how this policy is working. And I'll just go through a few examples. One is, and this is, I think, when I was promoting this book, I did tons and tons of radio, and one of the things that people hadn't heard of before is how China uses the judicial system to feed the black market for organs, for transplants in the whole world. There's this huge demand because medical care has advanced so much. There's this huge demand worldwide for organs, for transplant. And the largest provider actually is China, and where they get these organs is the whole world combined 2 years ago executed about 700 prisoners worldwide. I think Iran led with roughly 300, almost half. And this isn't anything against capital punishment. It's just to put the numbers in perspective. China, they estimate, Amnesty International estimates that China executes annually between 5,000 and 10,000 prisoners. So the whole world is 700. China is upwards to 10,000. And this can be for crimes as little as a few years ago they executed a farmer for chopping down trees without a permit. They've executed somebody before for evading tolls on toll roads. So, you don't have to be an axe murderer in China to be put to death. And there's no appeal in China, so if you go to court for one of these crimes and you're sentenced to death, they just take you out in the backyard, kneel you down, and put a bullet in the back of your head. There's no appeal. You don't get to say bye to mom. It's all over. So, but where this gets, I think, particularly scary is there was a bust in New York a few years ago where they had representatives of the Beijing government meeting with some Americans and some doctors who were posing as consumers of organs for transplant. And they had, these representatives of China had a price list. And it was how much different organs can cost if you want to buy them. And they said, we will shoot to order. So they were saying, you just tell us what you want and we'll get it for you. And investigations that have come out since then, it's been shown that prosecutors in China and judges have a list of what is in particular demand at that time. So if someone comes before a court, the prosecutor and the judge knows what the economic incentive is to convict this person and sentence them to death. So I think that's just sort of one egregious example of the place we're dealing with, and this is happening right now. Another is this idea, you know, how benevolent is our engagement, and are we just kidding ourselves? And I think the 2008 Beijing Olympics are a great example. I was living in